Welcome to video 1H on our second characteristic of a good tax, fairness. This is a long one, so get ready. If ever there was a tax topic that is open to debate, it is this one. Americans have a very strong sense of social justice, especially when it comes to themselves. There's a large body of research that shows that when Americans feel they're being treated unfairly, they experience a pain that often exceeds the pain of any physical punishment that may accompany the treatment. We hate unfairness more than a good old-fashioned beatdown. It should come as no surprise, then, that fairness in taxes is often used by politicians as a wedge issue to get us to see their side. The rich get all the tax breaks. The poor don't pay any taxes. These are both comments that trade on our inherent distaste for unfairness. We're going to break fairness or equity down into two components, one of which has little debate, and the other which is subject to much debate. What is true of both of these perspectives on fairness is that when taxpayers are asked to consider these concepts away from the politically charged environment that surround politics today, they almost universally believe in the measures of fairness. I'd argue we should be finding our common ground rather than shooting spitballs at one another. But that's probably why I teach taxes instead of running for office. The first element of equity is known as horizontal equity. This implies that people in the same position economically should pay the same tax. If, for example, you and I both generate the same income, there is a strong sense that we should also pay the same tax. If you somehow pay less tax, that would be inherently unfair to me. If I pay less tax, well, that's just because I so richly deserve to. Just kidding. That would be unfair to you. This is not generally about paying more or less than each other, but rather paying the same when we are doing the same thing. One of the elements of this equity rule we will fight about, however, is what it means to be in the same position, and that's in air quotes, or to have the same income. Should a 40-year-old married man with 3 kids pay the same tax as a single 21-year-old with no kids, even though they generate the exact same taxable income? This brings us back to the element of marginal utility. By the way, I swear that eventually we are going to decrease the focus on economics. But tax policy is economics smashed into politics, so suffer me a bit further. Given the cost structure of the married man with 3 kids and the cost structure of the kidless single 25-year-old, we might presume a different level of marginal utility as well. The married man may spend every dollar of income supporting his family with food, clothing, and shelter, whereas the kidless young single may use his disposable income for season tickets to the Padres. This raises the specter of the notion of ability to pay. And believe it or not, over and over again, we have a U.S. tax system that reflects most Americans' beliefs that ability to pay should play a role in setting tax policy. Simply put, those with greater ability to pay should pay more. Now, this doesn't necessarily broach the subject of graduated rates. Even a flat tax, those with higher incomes would pay more. And as it turns out, we mostly agree with that prescription. However, once we invoke ability to pay, we can now turn to our second element of equity or fairness, vertical equity. Vertical equity captures ability to pay at its heart. Those with a greater ability should pay more. It is our fascination with horizontal and vertical equity that have made our tax system so complex. Before we weigh in on our appetite for vertical equity, let me show you an example from the tax code of the complexity driven by these equity features. The tax code permits individuals to deduct a casualty loss. Think of a casualty loss that is derived from a catastrophic event that the taxpayer simply couldn't control. These sorts of losses are often associated with a flood or an earthquake or some other form of natural or man-made disaster that places a financial strain on the taxpayer. It would be hard to argue that losing your house in a flood would not be catastrophic to most, and if uninsured, almost certainly affect your ability to pay taxes, especially in the year of the loss. Okay, so this seems like good tax policy. If someone is financially crushed by a big loss, they could probably use a break on their taxes. But of course, the devil is in the details. What is a large loss? If Joe the plumber with 3 kids suffered a loss of $100,000 when his income is only $70,000 a year, that sounds pretty large. However, if Bill Gates suffered a loss of $100,000, well, that's nearly a child's play to a guy with over $1 billion. So maybe he doesn't deserve the same tax break. Okay, then let's measure the deductible casualty loss as something that exceeds a certain percent of your income. And after thinking about it for a while, Congress elected 10%. Anything in excess of 10% of your income that year is likely to be pretty catastrophic, so we'll permit a deduction. By trying to deal with vertical equity and the associated ability to pay, we have introduced complexity into the tax code. And just so we're clear, starting in 2018, personal casualty losses like these are only deductible if it's due to a federally declared disaster. Okay, let's take vertical equity to a degree of silliness, but really only to make a point. SpongeBob and Patrick are the only citizens of their town. SpongeBob is a high-income earner, and Patrick is a low-income earner. And for the sake of argument, assume that they are similar in every other way. So this is a little bit like the Three Brothers video that we watched earlier. The town decides it needs a new library. Both Patrick and SpongeBob agree that a new library will provide free educational opportunities for them and any other resident of their town, should someone else choose to move there in the future, to take advantage, of course, of the cool new library. And they are totally behind the idea. The new library is estimated to cost $20,000. So the question is, how should the tax be distributed to Patrick and SpongeBob? Well, let's examine 4 distinct possibilities. The first is a poll tax. That is, everyone pays the same. For SpongeBob and Patrick, that would be a flat $10,000. The second alternative is a flat rate tax. They both pay the same tax rate. To raise $20,000 on a total base of $210,000, the rate would be 9.5%. SpongeBob would pay about $19,000, with Patrick making up the remaining $1,000 or so. The third alternative is a graduated rate, where those with greater income pay more and at a greater rate. So Patrick pays at 5% and SpongeBob pays at 9.75%. The distribution of the tax is not that different from the second alternative, except that SpongeBob is burdened with an additional $500, while Patrick is relieved, of course, of that same amount. The fourth alternative is that Patrick share a greater burden under a graduated tax rate structure. Because SpongeBob's income is so much greater than Patrick's, even when Patrick pays 20% and SpongeBob only pays 9%, the vast majority of the burden still falls on SpongeBob. Now let's look at a few ways to analyze these rate structures. The top part of the table presents the tax rates. Option 1 seems untenable. How could we possibly tax Patrick and leave him with nothing? 100% tax rate rarely seems fair. SpongeBob's tax rate does not seem to vary too much, irrespective of Patrick's going up and down. However, seeing SpongeBob with a rate that nearly doubles Patrick's in option 3 seems inherently unfair. If we look at the second panel that presents the cash flow each would have after paying the tax, this is a presentation intended to draw our attention to the marginal utility of income. It shows how much or how little SpongeBob or Patrick would have left after taxes. Think of this measure as the "what does the taxpayer have left to spend on everything else they need" approach, and often shows how even after small tax burdens, low-income taxpayers have little to spend and are likely to suffer from the income effect, having to make up any additional tax through working more. It also presents the degree to which SpongeBob has money left over to spend. The final presentation is that of the percent on after-tax income under each plan. This presentation is also designed to highlight the effects of taxes on disposable income, and really highlights the effects of the fourth alternative as chewing up a great deal of Patrick's after-tax income. Which of these presentations is best? Who knows? What I do know is that each of these will be presented by either side of the argument if they think it presents their case in the best light. I think the key is to be sure and consider all of these presentations in trying to decide whether it is good tax policy. When we discuss the U.S. income tax rate structure, invariably the notion of redistribution of wealth arises. And depending on your political points of view, that might be a good thing or it might be a bad thing. One thing is clear. The U.S. income tax rate structure achieves a redistribution. Under the ability to pay principal, people with greater incomes pay more. Whether the tax structure should be progressive and to what degree is something we could spend all semester discussing, and probably still not agree. However, even the most ardent flat tax proponents espouse some form of progressivity for two primary reasons. The first is that most developed countries agree that a proper role for government is to provide a safety net for its citizens. That is, when tragedy befalls one of us, we all agree that some financial support makes sense. The degree and length of that support are points of controversy, but largely all but the most avid libertarians will agree on some form of safety net. The second, but perhaps less agreed upon perspective, is that those with more, frankly, have more to protect. The U.S. has very strong private ownership of property rights. That is, individual citizens have the right to own property and protect that property. U.S. citizens with little wealth arguably have little to protect. In a manner of speaking, when you're poor, you have little to take, although arguably what little you have is more precious. Wealthy citizens, on the other hand, have a great deal to lose should civilization, as we know it, collapse. Obama tried to make this point during his administration, but failed to do so meaningfully. We all benefit from roads and bridges, but who benefits more? The person that shops at Walmart or the person that owns Walmart? The arguments against a progressive rate structure almost always fall into the "why should the government be able to take what I've earned" camp. And as we've discussed, the substitution effect plays a role in deciding what degree of progressivity our income tax should have. Rates today are not as progressive as they have been in the past. But that does not, in and of itself, mean anything other than, well, they are different. It does not mean life was better when the highest marginal rate was 91% in 1963, nor worse when 35% in 2009. If anything, it strengthens the argument that we should focus not only on what we collect, but also what we spend as a country, knowing that low rates are wonderful. I'd love to pay 0% income tax, but unless I also cut spending, I'm simply writing checks for my kids to cash. So the redistribution will always be a source of tension. Just consider that the price of democracy. We can certainly vest our interest in a monarchy if we think that would provide a better result. Until then, what we can do is avoid meaningless confrontation over tax rates. First, get educated. If you really care, read some of the books on tax policy I mentioned in one of the previous videos. Analyze where the government is spending your money. Decide whether that's a good use for us as a country. Expect transparency from our elected officials. We are more likely to notice things when they are placed before us. The information is out there. Go find it, and then know your sources. Look, I love Fox News or MSNBC as much as the next guy, but if you think those sources are without bias, you have lost your mind. Use lots of sources and try to find the most credible ones, and that may or may not be the ones you generally agree with. Okay, that brings us to the end of video 1H on fairness. It was a long one, but that's because there's much to say on this topic, and frankly, we barely scratched the surface. It's hard to imagine a country in which fairness wasn't an overarching goal of the government. We may differ in how we define fairness, but ultimately, we get what we vote for. In the next video, we'll dig in on the remaining 3 characteristics. Thanks for watching.